there, and thanks for joining me on the program today on Dr. Teach Me to Parent. Today we have a program that's of vital importance to all of us. It has to do with the police, the family of the police, and how we as a community relate to our police department and to our policemen and policewomen, the men and women in blue, we sometimes refer to them. And a few years ago, I wrote a book entitled The Psychology Missive. The Psychology Missive was a memo. It was a memo to police officers and their families at a time of great deal of stress and violence in the street. So I tried to address that in this little book, The Psychology Missive. It's available through Amazon, and of course you can get it through my office as well. If you just call my office, it's on the screen there, the number, and you can pick that up there as well. We'll send it out to you. But the police officer today is under attack. There's no doubt about it. And the police officer today is questioned. Whether we even need police officers is being raised now as a question for discussion. But the thing that is really certain for all of us is that law enforcement today is a stressed profession. Police officers are under attack like they have never been under attack previously. It's probably one of the most difficult occupations today and professions today that young people consider. This past week, I have in my office as a psychologist, I have talked to a police officer every day. And some of them are looking into becoming, a police officer. Others are dealing with issues of stress related to their work as a police officer. So it brings to my attention the importance of the police today and for our communities, but also brings to my attention the degree of stress and difficulty that police officers face in the line of duty. Now, somehow back in about 1700, early 1700s, we have a man by the name of Peel that comes forward in London, England, and creates what is known then as a police force. And he designed the uniforms, he designed the hat that they wore, he designed their weaponry, he designed their strategies for policing, he designed their character that they needed to become a police officer, the qualifications. Mr. Peel was a police guru, and he's the one that set in place our police profession as we know it today. And when you go back and read his work and you read some of his thinking, it isn't very far off from what we've been doing. It isn't very far off from what communities do these days in terms of selecting police officers, assigning them a particular duty, and sending them out to work. So we go back in history to the early 1700s when we think of the police profession. Now, I have with me today a little baton. Sometimes we call this a baton, and sometimes it's a kind of weapon of the police department. And police officers from the early 1700s carried one of these sticks. And this happens to be a stick from the Chicago Police Department. And it was a standard piece of equipment for the police officer throughout history. And that was the weapon, if you will, that police officers used primarily to bring control where there was not control. So we have a whole history of police officers being armed, being encouraged to use those arms, and to bring into submission people who are violating the law in some kind of way. Now, when I say that the police are under a great deal of stress, put it this way. Before 2014, something happened about that point in time in history. About 2014, 2015, we would only have a few police officers shot and killed per year, about 64. And now 5 years later, 6 years later, we have about 164 police officers shot and killed per year. And now 4 years later from that, we have increased that number even greater. So today the police officers are not under only stress, but they're in a position, they're in a profession where their life is at stake. So we're now looking at a death rate by shootings among our police officers nearing 200 a year, where it used to be something like 64, per year. And the other thing is that we've had a number of police officers that have been killed by ambush. We saw that just last week in Minneapolis, where this young gentleman approached a police car, pointed a gun at two policemen, and shot them. Both survived, however, and thankfully so. And he's on loose still. They're searching for him. But that's called an ambush, where you go right up to a police officer and shoot him face to face, dead on. And over the years, we've had that happen. We've had about 8 per year. That's all. Until recently, in the last 3 or 4 years now, we've seen that double and triple and quadruple in the number of ambushes that have taken place. Not just the Minneapolis one, but we had Baton Rouge. We had Dallas, a few years before that. So we have had a number of these ambush killings taking place now in the last number of years. And we go back to about 2014. That's when the scale began to tip. And our police officers now became threatened as a profession and under stress like they had never known before. So we have to look at what happened in the 2014, 2015 period of time, and what is the thing that tipped the scale? Well, just take a look at Black Lives Matter and look at the influence that they've had, and the fact that the leader of the Black Lives Matter was invited to the White House to have a hearing with President Obama and gave his blessings to the Black Lives Matter movement. And we see that today as being a predominant movement in our streets and in our cities, and our participant in the violence and the protests that are taking place, today. So we wonder, where is this going, and what's all this about, and what are all the factors? Black Lives Matter is not the source, is not the only source, not the cause. There are many, many factors that take place. That's a discussion in itself. So we'll just leave it at that at this point in time, but that's the critical point in time in history in our country today, when police officers have to be viewed differently. And if you're going to become a police officer, you need to view the profession differently and give it serious thought as to whether this is really a profession for you and whether you can take the stress and the strains of the police officer today. Now, before I jump into a topic on this police officer, let me just give you a little quote that puts a little bit of perspective. A parent is not just a speaking acquaintance, but one who listens also. And, what you have here is a parent, whether it's a police officer or as a parent or any parent. You have to be more than just somebody that speaks to your children, talks to your children, converses with your children. You have to be much more than just one who lectures to your children and tells them what to do and gives them directions and all that kind of thing. A parent is more than that. An effective parent is one who listens. And that's the essence of that particular quote. It's the listening skill that parents need in bringing up their children today. Kids need to talk. Kids need somebody to talk to. Kids need a voice at the other end that will talk and interact with them and listen and be part of the conversation. Some years ago, I was associated with a group of students at a university. It was a hotline for suicide prevention, and it was called the Listening Ear. And we named it the Listening Ear because that's exactly what people need. It's exactly what people need at a time of crisis. It's a time of suicide is a time of crisis. A killing is a time of crisis. A death is a time of crisis. A trauma in the life of a family is a time of crisis. And what is needed at that point in time is a person who listens. And it's the parent's job to be that listener, to be that person whose ear is out there and interacts with the child and feels the feeling of the child, interacts with the feelings of the child, becomes part of the child's life, becomes part of the child's concern, and it has the empathetic interaction with the child at that time in history, and that time in the child's life of difficulty and stress and strain. And the police officer is the same situation. The police officer in the home needs a home, a family that listens, that is open and is considerate and is interactive in the listening process. So listening becomes the key issue in family life, and it becomes a key issue for all of us as we deal with stress, because stress is reduced when we have somebody who will listen to us, somebody who cares, and somebody who's empathetic, and somebody who takes time to be part of our experience and part of our life. Now, let me just bring to your attention a kind of an issue that takes place in the police process today as police go about their duties. You know, there's certainly two kinds of cops, two kinds of police officers. We call them the good cop and the bad cop. Now, good cops are probably about 90% of the police officer population. They're all good. They've been trained. They go into the field to be helpful. They think about it. They're well prepared. They're well trained. They're well oriented towards the community. They know the community. They care for the community. They care for people who are suffering. They want to help people. Police officers generally come from a perspective of healthy relationships and wanting to be a helpful person in the relationships with which they have contact. So the good cop situation, the bad cop situation, is part of our community, is part of our policing system. Thankfully, the majority, 90% or maybe even more than that, fall into the category of the good cop. And then we have some that we have in the category of the bad cop. Overly stressed, overly anxious, overly depressed, not being able to fulfill their life dream, frustrated for some reason, having bad personality traits, having a history of abuse, having a history of neglect, having a history of difficulty in their life that they bring to the job, they bring to their profession. And that's a small percentage of police officers, but there are some. And unfortunately, those police officers were not weeded out in the evaluation process that takes place in selecting a police officer. I do that. I evaluate police officers to see if they're fit for duty. And sometimes we miss the right ones, and sometimes we get it. But unfortunately, some of them slip through, or they become bad cops later in their life, later in their career. But we do have that issue of good cop, bad cop. But here's a second aspect of it. There are cooperative criminals, if you will, and there are belligerent criminals. There are people that the police come in contact with, might even be a traffic stop, might be whatever. They are cooperative. The majority of the public is cooperative. Probably 75%, 80% of the population that the police have contact with in a stop situation are cooperative. So we have good cops and bad cops interacting with a public that's cooperative. But then we have another group out there in our public that we refer to as belligerent. They have a beef against the police. They have a beef against society. They have a beef against their community. They carry a chip on their shoulder. They are hurt. They are abused. They are negative. They've been mishandled in their own life. They've been mistreated by their own fathers. They've been mistreated by authority figures themselves. And they come into the police contact situation as a belligerent community member. So if you take a look at these four possibilities, you have a good cop dealing with cooperative people, no problem. The issue is taken care of and both parties move on. Then we have a good cop having to deal with a belligerent person. It's more difficult, more stressful, but it usually gets resolved and both parties move on. So that's the good cop. Now we have a group of cops that we refer to as the bad cop. Now the bad cop has to deal with good people, cooperative people, and those usually go pretty well. Sure, the cop might be belligerent, might be a little bit tough, might be a little bit unfriendly, might be a little stiff, or but usually that situation is resolved fairly well and fairly quickly. But it was a strain, it was a stressful situation for both. Now here comes the rub. It's the combination between the bad cop and the belligerent community member. That's where the tough starts. That's where the tough part of it is. That's where the violence takes place. That's where the shootings take place. That's where the abuse takes place. That's where the hurt takes place. That's where the beatings take place. That's where the wrongdoings take place. When we have a bad cop and a belligerent community member coming together, that's where fire meets fire. And that's where the difficulty takes place. And that's where training needs to be focused in our officer training program. That's where the evaluations need to be focused on, to weed out the cops that would not deal with that kind of situation very well. So that's the critical point, and that's the critical combination of community member and cop that we see all too often now happening in our community, and it accounts for the rise and the increase in the number of cops that are being shot today, the number of cops that are shot by ambush, today, and then the number of cops that are committing suicide. Tremendous increase in the suicide rate among police today. So we are seeing some really difficult events taking place. But I think if you kind of understand that it's the bad cop and the belligerent community member, that's the hotbed. That's the combination. That's where the sparks take place. And that's what we need to learn how to avoid and learn how to train our police better and encourage our community to calm it down, to soften it, so that we don't have this kind of blow up where fire meets fire. So that's where we are in our discussion today in terms of our police and what's taking place in our police profession. Now, what I'd like to do is just to shift your attention to the family of the police officer. It's the family that is the critical piece in the life of a police officer. It's his or her family, the marriage, the parent, the extended family, the grandparents, the family members of the police officer. That's what we're talking about today. And I want to just indicate that there are positive families that have police officers within those families, and they do well. They support each other, they encourage each other, they do well together. And there are some families that are not so functional. They are dysfunctional. They don't do very well. They don't support the member of their family member who's a police officer. And they have strain and stress when they come home to their family. That's the problem. A police officer, to do well on the street, to do well in the course of his duties, needs a wellness place to return at the end of the day, and that's his home. A wellness home. A home that is welcoming and supportive and encouraging and positive and helpful and de-stressing, if you will. So let's take a look at the family of the police officer and kind of just see what some of the factors are that create a healthy and a positive police officer and can do his duties. So again, I refer you to my book. It's on the screen there in front of you. The Psychology Missive. It's a memo to all law enforcement officers at this time in their life under high degrees of stress and high degrees of strain. Now, there are some characteristics that are very important, for a police officer family. and to make sure that the police officer is supported and encouraged and can do the job, positively. Number one, a police officer needs a family that expresses appreciation, expresses approval, affirms the police officer, praises, and encourages. That's the kind of family that a police officer needs behind him, behind her, to make sure that the family back home is an encouraging family, is a supportive family, and is involved in the process of the police officer's work, daily work. The family that is involved, the family that is supportive, the family that is encouraging, the family that's part of the police unit, so to speak, is a positive family, and that's what a police officer needs when he goes off to work in the morning, to make sure that the family is behind him. The family has his back, so to speak. That's the kind of family that is needed by a police officer. Secondly, a police officer needs a family to come home to that is de-stressing. A family that knows how to de-stress. A family that knows how to relax. A family knows how to enjoy non-work hours. A family that knows how to get beyond the stress and the strains of the day. A family that knows how to listen. A family that knows how to talk about the experiences of the police officer that day, and then can stop and put it aside and move on with life and live a life that's positive, constructive, and healthy and enjoyable, for all. A police officer needs a family that will help him, will help her de-stress at the end of the stress, at the end of the shift, at the end of a stressful shift. So are you that kind of a family? That's what you have to look at. Not perhaps just police officers, but any of us that work in a high stressful job or profession. We need that family back home that's supportive, encouraging, but will give a different experience, will give a different outlook on life, so that stress is brought down and a person can relax, go to sleep, and go back to work the next day. So that family bonding experience is what is critical. But the bonding experience is a non-stressful bonding experience that a police officer needs and requires in the course of his day, and certainly when he comes home at night, at the end of his shift. That's what he comes home to. It's what he needs to come home to, and that's what a police officer family needs to consist of and manifest. Now, here's the third point. Good communication. Police officers need a family that communicate. They need a family that will talk, that will listen, that will interact, that will enjoy the stories, and that will give advice and give opportunity to just unfold a particular story that's stressful or difficult or was traumatic or whatever it might be. Good communicators are good listeners. Good listeners are good talkers. Good talkers, good listeners are good communicators. And that's what a family needs to be for a police officer. One who listens and one who talks, but one who encourages talking to take place within the family. A police officer cannot go home and have an empty wall or have an empty family that does not talk and engage and does not listen and is not interested in his or her day. So good communication is the byword of a strong family for a police officer. You need to develop those communication skills. And if you look at it this way, a police officer, to be a good police officer, must have good communication skills. A good police officer needs to learn how to talk and can talk and be assertive and be expressive and ask questions and consider and interact and develop a theme of talking, and talking becomes part of their business as a police officer. And he needs to come home to a family that also talks, that encourages talks, that teaches talking, encourages talking, welcomes talking. That's what a family needs to be for a police officer. And then there's a fourth point. Police officers need a family that make promises and follow through, make commitments and follow through. The promise-keeping family is essential for a police officer. Police officers are required to make their commitments and keep them. Police officers are required to make their promises and keep them. They want to come home to a family that likewise makes promises and keeps them, makes commitments and keeps them. Wife, children, parents, grandparents, whomever it might be. This is a family that makes commitments and keeps commitments, make promises and keeps promises. A police officer does well when he lives in a world that is predictable, lives in a world that is one that there is follow-through, that there is a result that comes from the efforts put forth and the promises made in that particular day. They work on promises, they come home and want to live in a home where promises are made and kept and honored. So that's important. Now here's the fifth one. Police officers deal with death. Police officers deal with immoral behavior. Police officers deal with awful, violent behavior in the course of a day. Police officers deal with the depth of darkness in the life of people, in the life of the community. They spend their day in the darkness of the community, in the dark spots of the community, with dark people of the community, with dark events that take place on the highways and in the homes and on the streets of the community in which they serve. So police officers have this sense of darkness that takes place, this depression that occurs in the course of their day, and they build on it. Some days are worse than others, obviously. But police officers have to kind of think of the idea that they deal with the dark aspects of a community on a day-to-day basis. They have to be prepared for it. They have to cope with it. They have to process it. That's trauma, if you will. That's depression, if you will. That's anxiety, the fear of what's going to happen when I make a call and I go to a call. That's how they live, with this high sense of anxiety, this high sense of depression, this feeling of darkness that they're going to be walking into, or they've just walked into and they're just dealt with and now trying to recover. So when they come home, they need a home that's relaxing. They need a home that's uplifting. They need a home that is positive. They need a home that is encouraging. They need a home that is happy. They need a home that laughs. They need a home that de-stresses. They need a home that enjoys each other. And they need a home where there's faith. They need a home where there's a religious sense. There's a religious tone. There's religious observation. There's a religious upbuild, so they can overcome the darkness with which they live in the course of the day. So a police officer family needs to be connected with a religious organization, with a church, with some kind of a religious group, to give a perspective of morality when they live a life of and deal with immorality in the course of the day. They need to experience an uplift and joy and positiveness and happiness when they have to deal with the unhappiness throughout their day of a community. So that's a factor that needs to be, considered as well. And then, lastly, of the 6 points, the police officer family needs to learn how to deal with crises, learn how to cope with crises, learn how to make something out of a crisis, learn how to benefit from a crisis. A police officer at the end of the day comes home having faced many crises in the course of his day or her day. And the way that you process crisis is to talk about it. The way you process a crisis is to just give a little picture about it and talk about it and have somebody empathetically listen. And then what can you learn from that? What can you take home from that? How can you benefit from the crisis that took place in your job today and the community streets of the day? What are the things that can now be learned from the crisis that is that's part of the life of the officer? So crisis you cannot be afraid of, but crisis is something you learn from and you deal with and you accept as part of the experience. So, when we look at the police officer family, very, very important key role in the effectiveness of the police officer. Very important if the police officer is going to do his job or her job that day on the street. The officer cannot have the distraction of a home that is in disarray, the distraction of a home that's in crisis, the distraction of a home that's dysfunctional, the distraction of a marriage that's dysfunctional, because that will divert his attention, divert his energy, divert his focus. So if you have a home that cannot stand up to the standards that I just identified, the 6 points I just mentioned, if you're having trouble in these areas, you need to do something. You need to get a hold of a counselor, and you need to go together, husband and wife, family, parents, whatever, and start talking about it. Start dealing with the problems of your home and get them resolved, get them taken care of, so that they are not a drain, they are not a distraction, they are not a defeating element in the life of a police officer. The home has to be positive. The home has to be functional. The home has to be a positive place that communicates and enjoys, where there's laughter and there's enjoyment together, and where there's an uplift, and where there's somebody who will listen and somebody who will take time and listen and be part of your life. That's what that home needs to be. But if you're not that home, you need to become that home. And you need to become that home by doing some reading on the topic of family life. You need to be that family by getting into a counseling program with somebody. Find a therapist in your community that you can talk with, and go 10 times, go 20 times, but get it resolved and get some relief from the stresses and strain that takes place in the home, because there's sure stresses and strain that takes place in the street for the police officer. So there you are. Good to talk to you in this first little bit. We're going to take a break now, and I want to come back and just talk about the police officer. Who are the effective police officers? Who are the good police officers? How to become a good police officer? What do you need to do to cross over from being an ineffective bad cop to being an effective good cop? What are the good cops like? What are the people who are on the street day upon day upon day doing their duties, but they do it well, and they're a pride to their community? We're going to talk about that cop in just a few minutes. See you. Have a cup of coffee and see you in a bit.
The in-house services we offer here are Total Life Change, anger management, one-on-one biblical counseling. We do a marriage enrichment, codependency and chemical dependency one-on-one counseling. We have a relapse prevention piece. We also do a lot of workshops where we inform and educate people on different topics. There is one-on-one individual sessions, and we also have group therapy that we work in a group. We find that can be so advantageous when you know you're not alone. The key is to call, email, online, and get a hold of one of the receptionists here, and we will do an assessment. We are not here to direct, guide, and force. We're here to meet you where you're at, then direct, then guide, and then give you options to break free.
When I set foot on the campus to come visit it, I was struck by how open and how welcoming the students and the professors were. Coming to Gordon was like coming home.
I think intentional community is what Jesus modeled with his disciples, and Gordon has really fostered a good place for intentional community to happen.
Gordon is a place where you can meet people from all over the world and hear their stories. I meet a lot of different people who are shaping who I am today.
Gordon seeks to graduate men and women of character, of leadership, and the world is the place where Gordon students belong.
Choosing to go to Gordon was, I think, one of the best decisions I've made in my life. I expect to be changed.
Welcome back. Glad to have you join us again on our second part of this series on our talk on the police officer and the police officer's family. You know, it's not just the police officer that does his job, good or bad, but it's a family in back of the police officer that allows the police officer to do his or her job, good or bad. So it's a combination here. It's the interaction that a police officer has with his community, but it's also one that he has with his family. You can't overlook the family. You can't overlook what the family contributes to the effectiveness of a police officer. If the family is dysfunctional, if the marriage is dysfunctional, if the children are dysfunctional of a police officer, if he goes home or she goes home to a dysfunctional home, the work that that police officer does during the course of the day will probably also be dysfunctional. And that's the rub. That's why the police officer family is so critical. And we have to make sure that we pay attention to what is going on in the home of the police officer, because then that will tell us what kind of a job the police officer does and will do in the course of his duty day upon day. So in our first part today, we really focus on what it's like to be a police officer family and what a police officer needs in a family, a well-functioning family, so the officer can do a well-functioning job. That's the combination. That's what we're talking about. And now I want to shift my attention a little bit to the police officer himself or herself. You know, police officers come from a wide variety of background. Often, they come from a background where there's a police or law enforcement officer in their family history. The father, the uncle, a grandparent, or somebody, a brother, or whomever, were a police officer. And that's how they were attracted to the profession of law enforcement. So police officers usually come from a background where there is that feeling or there is that appreciation for law enforcement, for the service of the community, and for doing good for the community on behalf of the community. So police officers come from that kind of perspective. But what are some of the characteristics? What are some of the traits that good cops need, that good cops have? Well, a study was done several years ago in San Gabriel, California. And in San Gabriel, a captain of the police office association of that city developed a study and looked at what made good cops. What were the factors that contributed to good leadership, factors that contributed to good cop behavior, and came up with a list. He actually came up with 13 different items of what makes up good copping, a good cop, a good police officer, a good leader within the police department. So I'm going to take a look at some of these today. I'm not going to go through all 13 of them, but I'll take a look at some of them as to what he came up with and what a police officer needs to have in his personality, needs to have in his behavior patterns, needs to have in his lifestyle so that he functions well on behalf of the community that he serves. So what are some of these traits? What are some of these characteristics that make up a good cop? Okay? Here it is one. A lifelong learner. This particular study found that good cops, those that become leaders, those that become distinguished in their department, have an orientation towards lifetime learning. They read books on law enforcement, they read books on their community, they read books on sociology, they read books on criminology. They read the magazines and the trade journals of their association, their police association. They read, they learn, they go back to school, they take continuing education classes. They do things that bring about an enhanced learning, an updated learning, if you will, so that they not only are a good cop, but they continue to be a good cop, and they become a better cop through lifetime learning. Lifetime learning is an essential element. It was one of the top elements that distinguishes a good cop from a bad cop, a good cop from a mediocre cop, a good cop from one that becomes an excellent cop and becomes even a leader of his police department. Now, lifetime learning, that's number one. Number two is good cops have a high level of energy. In other words, they're healthy. They're healthy people. They have energy throughout the day. They don't get tired necessarily at the 3/4 of their shift and then have to almost take a break or take a nap. They have the energy to get through the test of the day, get through the shift of the day. They have energy to extend it even if they need to, because there are many times when a police officer does not go home at the end of his 8-hour shift or 10-hour shift. They have to go on to 11 hours or 12 hours or whatever it might be because of the situation in which they're involved. Take a look at the police officers that are dealing with the streets of Portland and Minneapolis and LA and various other places that are in upheaval these days. They're working extensive long hours, 2 shifts, if you will. So an effective police officer, a good cop, an effective one, needs to have a high level of energy and not just think that he's going to manage the street from the seat of his car as he drives around the community, or from the desk of his police officer headquarters or wherever it might be. High energy level, adequate energy level, sufficient energy level for the job. That's necessary. An effective police officer does not drag his tail through the day's shift or through the second half of the day's shift. He has energy for the end of the shift as he had energy for the beginning of the shift. So an energy level is very, very important. And if you're one that does not have sustained energy, there's reason for that. And perhaps that needs to be evaluated. And maybe you need to get some kind of a program together that will generate energy, an exercise program, a health program, a vitamin program, a medical checkup, or whatever it might be, to deal with that so that the energy level is sustainable, throughout the day. So that's the second point. Here's the third one. The study found this, that effective police officers, great police officers, effective and great police officers have great attitudes. They have positive attitudes. They are encouragers. They encourage their colleagues. They encourage their other officers. Just as they move about and as they interact, they are a source of encouragement. They are a source of support. They're a source of help. They're willing to step in and help. They're willing to give some guidance. They're willing to listen, and they're willing to give some suggestions or some advice as to how something might be handled. They have a good attitude. In other words, they are there for the good of the community. They're there for the good of themselves. They're there for the good of their colleagues. They're there for the good of their police force. So police officers that have a good attitude are effective police officers, and the ones that we want, the ones that are that stand out as being the great officers of the day or of the force that they serve in. The great attitude of just being there for somebody else, being willing to step forward into the problem or into the life or into the circumstance, the situation of someone else, and do what is necessary to get the job done, to take care of the situation that's being dealt with in a stressful kind of way at the present time. So good attitudes become a very, very important part of a positive, effective police officer. Now, let me give you number 4 that was found in this, and that is to be consistent and steady. To be consistent and steady. You know, you have an 8-hour shift. You have a 10-hour shift. You have a 12-hour shift. Be consistent throughout it. Be steady throughout it. Be able to pace yourself to get from the beginning to the end with sufficient energy and with an attitude that's positive and with a feeling that you're doing something right and good and well, so that you enjoy what you're doing, throughout the day. And when you come home, you're still a reasonable person as you interact with your family and get their relief and get their strength that they give you so you can go back and do it again another day. The consistency and the steadiness is required of effective police officers. Now, let me give you another one. Getting the job done. Good police officers, effective police officers, good cops get the job done. They have an assignment for the day. They get that before they start their shift, and they carry out that assignment. They do it. They do it in a timely way, no matter what the distractions are or the interferences are for the day, the other calls that they have to deal with and take care of. But their assignment is given, that assignment is fulfilled, that assignment is achieved, and the whole police office, the whole police department functions well together. So a good cop, an effective cop, a great police officer is one that has the energy for the day and has a commitment to get through the day in a positive way and to do the task that has been assigned him for that particular day. To not get sidetracked or to not get off on other kind of issues that will distract the attention, but to be focused and to make sure that that job gets done so that you can go on to the next day and do whatever job that is, for that day that's been assigned, to you. Now, here's another factor that was good cops, great cops. They are the go-to people. They are the ones that are willing to sit and listen. They're the ones that are willing to share resources, share names, share places. They know the community. They know the hot spots of a community. They know the dark spots of a community. They know the light spots of a community. They know where the action is. They know where the action needs to be focused. They are knowledgeable, but they're also willing to share that information with their colleagues. That's a necessary factor. So good cops have knowledge of the community. They know the community well. They know how the community functions and how it dysfunctions. And they're a person in the resource. They're a resource within their department of what we call the go-to people. They know, and they're willing to share their knowledge, and they're willing to train their colleagues to do well and to do as they do and to know what they know and to not keep it to themselves, not to be private about their information, but to share that with their police colleagues so that they all do better, they all function better. That's what a good cop is. Now, another important part of a good cop is a cop that can persuade. Good cops persuade. They don't have to use the billy club. That's an object of persuasion, but they don't have to use that. They can persuade by voice. They can persuade by argument. They can persuade by reason. They can persuade by accommodation. They can bargain. They can negotiate. They can bend. They can deal back and forth with somebody who is belligerent. So when they deal with the belligerent population, the belligerent citizen, a good cop knows how to use persuasion to bring about an arrest, to bring about a resolution to the situation that's taking place without having to use force. That's what a good cop does. Now, obviously, there's times when force has to be used. A billy club needs to be used. A gun needs to be used. A taser needs to be used. Pepper spray needs to be used, and so on. There are various mechanisms that a good cop has at his disposal or her disposal, and a bad cop has at his or her disposal. But the point of a good cop, a strong cop, a leader cop, is one that uses persuasion as the primary tool, the primary instrument of bringing about an arrest, bringing about some kind of resolution to a tense piece of conflict that's taking place in the community. Now let me give you another one. Empathy. Empathy. Good cops have empathy. Good cops feel. Good cops feel as you feel. Good cops feel as the person they are arresting feels. Good cops can know the feelings of those that they are dealing with and trying to bring under control, if you will, or to issue a ticket or whatever they might do. A good cop is empathetic, is caring, is open to discussion, is open to reason, is open to a banter, a back and forth, is open to discussion and talk and understanding and trying to understand the other person's point of view or what took place, but to be there to listen and then to make a decision as to what they do and how they deal with that particular situation and how they resolve it. You see, empathy is where you start. You feel, you get a sense of what's going on, and you feel for the other person. You feel for the person you're dealing with, you're confronting as a police officer. But that sense of empathy is a critical emotion, it's a critical attitude, it's a critical feeling, it's a critical mindset that a good cop has to have, and good cops do have, if you will. So empathy becomes a very, very important part of one's manner as a police officer, and one that is good for a police department, good for a shift, good for partners that work together, colleagues that work together, where there's empathy that's shared and understanding, where you understand each other. You understand the difficulties and the hurts and the problems that other people have. An empathetic cop listens to his colleagues. When the colleagues are in trouble, when the colleagues don't have a home that's been very helpful or very supportive, they listen. Empathetic cops are ones that give advice and give suggestions and motivates and encourages and builds up and gives hope to their fellow officers. So develop that sense of empathy if you're a police officer so that you can work together with your colleagues and do it right and do it well. Well, anyway, those are some of the characteristics, some of the traits that separate a good cop from a bad cop, a good cop from a great cop. And what we want to do is we want to make our bad cops good cops, and we want to make our good cops great cops. We're always in that process of improving and strengthening and building up and becoming something better. And this is the opportunity. You have a family home. It needs to have characteristics that are supportive and encouraging and are enriching and are helpful. And you need to have a colleague system that is in place that is encouraging and supportive and helpful to each other. But you as the cop, whether you're at home or you're on the beat, you're in the headquarters or wherever you are a person of strength and character and goodness and motivation and empathy and advice and suggestions and support for yourself, but for each other as well. So before we end today, let me come to another quote and put this in kind of perspective. What we've been talking about today is my book, The Psychology Missive. It's a memo to law enforcement officers who are working in a world of stress and violence, working on the streets of stress and violence. So Amazon, pick it up at Amazon. Or you can pick it up at my office, and we'll send you out a copy of that. 559-244-3260 is the telephone number. So it's on the screen there in front of you, and feel free to give me a call, and we'll get a copy out to you. So here's the quote for the day that I'd just like to bring to your attention. Parents are not a fruit for enjoyment only, but also an opportunity for service. You know, parents play a multi-role in our life. And sure, they are people of enjoyment. They should be people of enjoyment. Kids should get a great deal of enjoyment from their parents and being around their parents and learning from their parents and interacting with their parents. That should be a given. But parenting is also an opportunity to give service. Give service to your children, to your extended family, to your neighbors, to your community, to your church, to your lodge, to your groups of people with whom you associate, to your community, to your world, on and on and on. Parents need to be a source of encouragement and a source of service and a source of goodness to the world in which they operate. And you think of parents of police officers, they need to be parents of encouragement to the law enforcement officer and their family. Back them up, pray for them, support them, talk to them, listen to them, be part of their life, go to work with them, know what they're doing, be informed, be aware, but be a team. Police officers live in the context of a team. They team up during the day, and they team up in their home. So, on the screen there, you see the parenting course that I have written. My book is Dr. Teach Me to Parent. We made that into a course now that you can take online. You can get it from the book if you want to read the book, or you can get it online, Parenting Better, Fresno Pacific University. And there's the course and the number that you identify the course with, and just take it. There's the address on the screen, the email address that you go to. Pick it up and take the course on parenting. If you happen to be required to take a course on parenting by the courts or by somebody else, that's a course you may want to consider and take. Do it at your own pace. You can do it over the course of a couple months or a year or whatever. Just do it at your own pace. But pick up a course on parenting, and that's the one that I recommend for you. Well, anyway, nice to have you with me today, and thanks, and bye for now.